I knew something was wrong before I even turned on a Maple Ridge Drive. You ever get that feeling where your stomach tightens for no reason at all? Like some part of you notices trouble before your brain catches up? That's exactly how I felt that afternoon. I had just driven 6 hours back from a fishing trip in northern Tennessee, exhausted, sunburned, ready to take a shower and sleep for 12 straight hours. Instead, the second I came around the last curve before my house, I saw blue lights flickering above my fence line. At first, I thought maybe an ambulance was parked nearby. Then I got closer. The lights were coming from my backyard. I remember slowing my truck almost to a stop. My suitcase was still sitting on the passenger seat. The radio was playing some old country song I'd heard 1,000 times before, but suddenly everything felt strangely quiet. When I pulled into the driveway and stepped out, I just stood there staring. Because where part of my backyard used to be, there was a swimming pool. Not a small one. Not one of those cheap, above-ground pools people put up for summer. I'm talking about a full luxury setup. Stone decking, built-in waterfall, LED lighting, expensive lounge chairs, music playing through outdoor speakers, and about 15 complete strangers drinking cocktails like they'd rented the place for the weekend. For a second, I honestly wondered if I was standing at the wrong house. Then somebody waved at me. Actually waved. Like I was arriving late to a party. And standing near the edge of the pool was the one person I immediately recognized. My neighbor, Trevor Callahan. Now, Trevor wasn't exactly popular around our neighborhood. People respected his money. That's different. Respect and liking somebody aren't always the same thing. Trevor owned several luxury car dealerships throughout central Kentucky and made sure everybody knew it. He drove a different vehicle every week, wore watches that cost more than most people's mortgages, and somehow managed to mention his success in nearly every conversation. 2 years earlier, he had bought the house next to mine. Massive modern place, black steel windows, concrete walls, perfect landscaping, the kind of house that looked like an architect designed it after losing an argument with happiness. The problem started almost immediately. First, my lawnmower was too loud. Then my dog Cooper barked too much. Then leaves from my oak tree landed near his patio furniture. Every interaction felt like he was filing a complaint disguised as small talk. Still, even with all that, I never imagined I'd come home to find a swimming pool sitting on my property. I walked toward what remained of the fence. Because half the fence was gone. Removed completely. Fresh concrete stretched across ground I'd owned for over a decade. Trevor spotted me and smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not an embarrassed smile. The smile of a man who thought he'd already won. There he is, he called out, lifting a drink. Back from vacation. I looked around slowly, then back at him. What the hell is this? To this day, I remember what happened next because it was so absurd. He laughed. Actually laughed. Like I'd asked the funniest question in the world. Oh, relax, Grant, he said. It's basically a shared improvement project. I stared at him. A shared what? He spread his arms proudly. Look at it. This probably increased your property value. I felt my jaw tighten. You build a pool on my land. His smile faded slightly. Not because he felt guilty. Because he seemed annoyed I wasn't impressed. Well, he said carefully, the property lines weren't exactly clear. That statement almost made me laugh. Because they were clear. Painfully clear. There were survey markers. Official records. Everything. I pointed toward the far corner of the yard. No, Trevor. They were crystal clear. Then something happened that changed the entire conversation. He pointed toward an old section of grass near the oak tree. You never even used that part anyway. The words hit harder than he realized. Because he wasn't pointing at empty grass. He was pointing at memories. That was where my father used to sit every morning drinking coffee after my mother passed away. That was where we'd buried my golden retriever years earlier. That corner wasn't empty. It was part of my life. But Trevor didn't see any of that. All he saw was unused space. Potential. Profit. Something he could take and improve. I looked him straight in the eye. You've got 24 hours to fix this before I call the city. For the first time all afternoon, his smile came back. Only this time it looked different. Smaller. More dangerous. Go ahead, he said. Then he took another sip of his drink and turned away. Like the conversation was already over. Standing there watching strangers swim in water, sitting on top of my property, I had no idea that Trevor already knew something I didn't. And before the week was over, I was about to find out exactly why he seemed so confident. The next morning, I started making phone calls before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. I called the city permit office, then zoning, then the county records department, then zoning again because the first person transferred me to the wrong extension. By lunchtime, I had spoken to 6 different people and somehow learned absolutely nothing useful. Finally, a woman named Carol from the permit department called me back. Carol sounded exhausted, not rude, just tired in that very specific government office way that comes from spending 20 years explaining the same problem to different people. She pulled up the file while I sat at my kitchen table staring out the window at Trevor's pool. I could hear laughter drifting across the yard. Music, someone cannonballing into water that technically belonged on my property. Carol sighed. Looks like the contractor submitted expansion plans while you were away. What expansion plans? Pool construction, retaining wall, deck installation. And nobody checked the property lines? Long pause. Another sigh. Apparently not thoroughly enough. That was the first bad answer. The second one was worse. At this point, she said carefully, it's likely considered a civil matter. A civil matter. I must have repeated those words 50 times that week. A civil matter. As if somebody building part of a resort on your property was the same thing as arguing over a mailbox. Every door I knocked on led nowhere. Every phone call ended the same way. Lawyers wanted retainers. The city wanted patience. The county wanted paperwork. Meanwhile, Trevor was throwing pool parties every weekend like he just won a championship trophy. And maybe the most frustrating part wasn't even Trevor. It was how normal everybody else acted. A few neighbors complimented the project. One guy down the street called it a great addition to the neighborhood. A woman walking her dog actually stopped and told Trevor the pool looked beautiful. I remember standing in my kitchen listening to that conversation and wondering if I was losing my mind. Because somehow the guy who stole land looked successful, and the guy who owned it looked bitter. After about 2 weeks of getting nowhere, something inside me changed. Not anger. Exhaustion. There's a difference. Anger burns hot. Exhaustion settles deep. One evening, I was standing near the back fence watching water trickle down behind Trevor's retaining wall when I noticed something strange. A narrow strip of untouched ground, maybe 4 feet wide. The contractors had ignored it completely. Technically, it was still mine. I walked over and started looking more carefully. The soil stayed damp even though we hadn't had rain in days. Tiny streams of runoff kept collecting near the same spot. At first, I didn't think much about it. Then I remembered something my grandfather used to tell me when I was a kid growing up outside Lexington. My grandfather built fishing ponds. Small ones. Nothing fancy. Just enough to attract wildlife and hold water naturally. And he'd always say the same thing. Water wants a home. If you give it one, it'll stay. That memory stayed with me all night. Then all the next day. Then the day after that. And slowly an idea began forming. Not revenge exactly. At least not at first. More like restoration. That's what I told myself anyway. A week later, I bought a shovel. Every evening after work, I headed to that little strip of land. No contractors, no permits, no giant machinery. Just me, a shovel, a wheelbarrow, and a growing sense of determination. The first few days looked ridiculous. I dug holes, moved dirt, changed my mind, dug somewhere else. If anybody watched from a distance, they probably assumed I was gardening. Trevor certainly didn't care. He was too busy entertaining guests. One Friday night, his backyard looked like a luxury resort commercial. Music, string lights, bartenders, people taking selfies. I remember hearing somebody say, "This place is incredible." Meanwhile, I was standing 50 feet away covered in mud. And oddly enough, I was happier because for the first time since coming home, I was actually doing something. Little by little, the project took shape. The runoff naturally filled the lowest sections. The damp soil helped. Then I discovered a shallow underground spring feeding through the clay underneath. Nothing dramatic, just a steady trickle. But it was enough. By the 3rd week, there was a pond. Small at first, then larger. I lined sections with river stone, added native grasses, planted water lilies, installed a tiny solar fountain, built a shaded area using reclaimed cedar from an old storage shed. It wasn't expensive. Honestly, compared to Trevor's pool, it looked almost laughably simple. But it felt alive. Real. One Saturday morning, I hammered a wooden sign into the ground. Wildlife Habitat Restoration Area. That sign lasted exactly 3 hours before Trevor noticed it. He walked over carrying a bottle of sparkling water and wearing loafers that probably cost more than my monthly truck payment. He stared at the pond, then at me. What exactly is this supposed to be? I leaned on the shovel. A habitat project. You build a swamp. It's a pond. It smells. I looked around dramatically. Smells like outside. His jaw tightened immediately. That response annoyed him more than any argument could have. Because people like Trevor expect resistance. They know how to fight. What they don't know how to handle is amusement. He folded his arms. You're doing this to irritate me. No, I smiled. I'm using my property. For a second, neither of us spoke. We both understood exactly what that sentence meant. Then he turned around and walked away. The funny thing is I genuinely believed that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Because 3 days later, right around sunrise, the first ducks arrived. 2 mallards, a male and a female. They landed quietly on the pond while I sat drinking coffee on my porch. At first I thought they'd leave by afternoon. Instead, they stayed. The next day they came back. Then a few more showed up. Within 2 weeks, there were ducks everywhere. And apparently ducks have excellent marketing departments because they started bringing friends. Geese arrived. Turtles appeared. Dragonflies skimmed across the water every evening. Frogs started singing after sunset. Kids from around the neighborhood began riding their bikes over to see what had become of the little pond. One girl named Emma started calling it Fairy Lake. That nickname stuck. Soon even adults were using it. How's Fairy Lake doing? Any new ducks at Fairy Lake? The place developed a personality, a presence. And that's when Trevor started having problems. Because the wildlife absolutely loved hanging around his pool. The water attracted insects. The insects attracted ducks. The ducks attracted more ducks. Every morning feathers floated across his infinity edge. Duck tracks appeared on expensive stone decking. In the peaceful luxury atmosphere Trevor worked so hard to create slowly began transforming into something he couldn't control. Nature had discovered his backyard. And nature, as it turns out, wasn't particularly interested in respecting property values. By the end of that month, Trevor was standing at his pool staring at a line of ducks, sunbathing beside the water feature he'd spent thousands of dollars building. And for the first time since all this started, he didn't look confident anymore. He looked worried. What neither of us realized yet was that the ducks were only the beginning. What happened over the next month was one of the most entertaining things I've ever witnessed, and the strangest part was that I barely had anything to do with it. The ducks handled most of the work themselves. At first, Trevor tried to stay calm, or at least pretend to. Whenever we'd cross paths, he'd force a smile and act like everything was under control. But every morning I could see new feathers floating in his pool. Every afternoon, another group of ducks would wander across his expensive stone deck, like they were inspecting property they planned to purchase. The real trouble started when his guests noticed. One Saturday afternoon, I was trimming grass near the pond when I overheard a woman standing by Trevor's fence. Are those mosquitoes? You would have thought she'd spotted a radioactive hazard. Another guest slipped on duck droppings near the shallow end and nearly launched himself into a decorative fire feature. I had to walk back inside because I was laughing too hard to remain polite. Trevor escalated quickly after that. First came the ultrasonic animal deterrents. Little black devices appeared around the pool. The ducks ignored them completely. Then came motion-activated sprinklers. Those mostly ended up soaking Trevor's guests. One poor guy carrying a tray of drinks got blasted square in the chest and stood there looking like he'd just lost an argument with God. Then Trevor hired a wildlife control specialist. That meeting remains one of my favorite memories. The specialist drove an old pickup truck that looked older than both our houses combined. He climbed out chewing sunflower seeds, looked at my pond, looked at Trevor's pool, then shook his head. Trevor immediately launched into a 10-minute explanation about nuisance animals, property interference, and environmental disruption. The man listened patiently, then pointed toward the pool. You got water? Trevor nodded. Obviously, The specialist pointed toward my pond. He's got better water. Trevor blinked. What does that mean? It means ducks ain't stupid. I nearly dropped my coffee. The specialist left 20 minutes later. The ducks stayed. By July, Trevor had stopped pretending to be civil. One night, powerful floodlights appeared aimed directly toward the pond. Another week, he filed a complaint with the Homeowners Association claiming my wildlife habitat reduced luxury property appeal. That complaint didn't go very far, especially after several neighborhood families started visiting Fairy Lake with their kids. Funny how public opinion changes when children fall in love with something. Then came the 4th of July party. The big one. Trevor no expense. Professional bartender. Ghee. Custom lighting. Catered food. At least 30 guests. The whole backyard looked like a magazine advertisement for wealthy, suburban perfection. Around sunset, I sat on my porch watching from a distance. Not spying. The party was impossible to miss. Music echoed through the neighborhood. People laughed. Fire pits glowed. Everything looked exactly the way Trevor wanted. Perfect. Then nature showed up. Right in the middle of the fireworks display, a mother duck marched across the pool deck, followed by 7 tiny ducklings. The timing couldn't have been better if somebody had written it into a movie. The DJ actually lowered the music. Conversation stopped. People turned and stared. One duckling slipped into the shallow tanning ledge and started paddling in circles. For a few seconds, the entire party focused on the ducks. Not Trevor, not the pool, not the fireworks. The ducks. And standing there beneath thousands of dollars worth of decorative lighting, Trevor looked absolutely defeated. That was the moment I finally understood something. The pool had never really been about swimming. It was a trophy, a symbol, proof that he could reshape anything around him. Proof that success meant control. The problem was that nature doesn't care about control. And eventually, neither does reality. About 6 weeks later, reality finally arrived. Not because of me. That's the funny part. I never sued him. I never started a social media campaign. I never called the local news. Trevor created his own downfall. One of his contractors filed paperwork for another patio expansion. That triggered a new county inspection. A different inspector this time. His name was Raymond. Older guy. Quiet. The kind of man who trusted measurements more than conversations. The moment Raymond stepped into the backyard, something felt different. He spent hours examining survey markers, reviewing permits, checking property boundaries, measuring distances. Trevor followed him everywhere, talking constantly, trying far too hard to sound relaxed. There was some confusion during construction. We've basically resolved everything privately. Nothing serious. Raymond barely responded. He just kept measuring. Eventually, he walked over to my porch. You the original owner? Been here 11 years. He nodded, then asked a very simple question. You ever signed permission for construction on your property? No. That single word changed everything. I watched Trevor's face lose color. Not dramatically. Just enough. The confidence cracked. For the first time since this whole mess began, he looked uncertain. 2 days later, the official notice arrived. Unlawful encroachment. Structural violations. Drainage code violations. The pool extended nearly 12 feet onto my property in some areas. The retaining wall violated county regulations. Multiple sections would have to be removed. The county gave Trevor 90 days to bring everything into compliance. He was furious. One evening I came home and found him standing beside the fence waiting for me. The second I stepped out of my truck, he started talking. You think this is funny? I shut the door. Not really. Sounds expensive. His face turned bright red. You could have stopped this. I actually laughed. Not because I wanted to, because I genuinely couldn't believe what I was hearing. I could have stopped you from building a pool on my property. You knew there were problems. No, Trevor. I looked him directly in the eye. You knew there were problems. You just assumed nobody would push back hard enough to matter. For a brief moment, something changed in his expression. Maybe regret. Maybe embarrassment. Maybe the realization that he'd spent so long believing his own story that he forgot everybody else could see the truth. Then his eyes drifted toward Fairy Lake. This whole duck thing was childish. I followed his gaze. The pond reflected the evening sky. Tall grasses moved gently in the breeze. A few ducks floated peacefully across the surface. The old oak tree mirrored itself in the water. Honestly, the place felt more alive than any luxury pool ever could. Maybe, I said, but at least I built mine on my own land. That one landed exactly where it needed to. He stared at me for a moment, then turned and walked away. 3 weeks later, demolition crews arrived. And if you've never watched a section of illegally built luxury pool get jackhammered at 7 o'clock in the morning, let me tell you something. It's surprisingly therapeutic. The infinity edge disappeared first, then sections of the deck, then part of the waterfall. Day by day, the project shrank until it finally fit where it should have been from the beginning. The party stopped after that. No more late-night music. No more crowds. No more performances. Trevor still lives next door. We don't talk. Sometimes I catch him standing in his backyard, looking toward Fairy Lake. I've never figured out exactly what he's thinking. Maybe resentment. Maybe regret. Maybe confusion over how a battle he thought he'd already won somehow slipped away. As for me, most mornings I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and watch the ducks glide across the water. Kids still stop by. Emma still calls it Fairy Lake. And every time I look toward that corner of the yard, I think about something this whole experience taught me. Some people believe ownership means power. Some believe money means permission. But memories have value too. Boundaries matter. And eventually the truth settles exactly where it belongs. Sometimes it arrives through lawyers. Sometimes through inspectors. And every once in a while, it arrives with feathers. Now I want to hear from you. If a neighbor built part of a luxury pool on your property while you were away, what would you have done? Would you have gone straight to court? Would you have handled it peacefully? And be honest, did Trevor deserve everything that happened? Or did Grant take things too far with the duck pond? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because stories like this always divide people right down the middle. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who thought money put them above the rules, share your story too. I'd love to read it.